What if the second chance the world owed you came wrapped in ice, blood, and a girl's kiss that ended in a bat to your skull? This is the story of a man who died once, remembered everything, and came back hungry for revenge. His name is Hanfong, and before the world froze over, nobody in his apartment complex thought twice about him. Just another broke, unemployed guy with a crush he couldn't win, and a life going absolutely nowhere. But behind that unremarkable face was something nobody could see coming. Because Hanfong had already lived this exact nightmare before, down to the very last second of his life. In his first timeline, the sky didn't just get colder, it broke completely. Temperatures plunged towards 60 degrees below zero, and South Korea turned into a frozen concrete tomb. Heat became more valuable than gold, food more precious than any currency ever printed. People who once shared elevators and small talk turned into predators overnight. Building hallways became battlegrounds, and neighbors became the enemy. In that world, Hanfong wasn't a survivor. He was prey. He had a crush, a girl named Hyiona, sweet-faced and soft-spoken, or so he believed. On the night everything fell apart, she showed up at his door shivering, desperate, and beautiful. He let her in without hesitation, because that's who he was back then, kind to a fault. What happened next felt like a dream he never wanted to wake from. She kissed him first, deep and eager, like she'd been waiting years to do it. She confessed feelings she claimed had always been there, hidden under the surface. She pressed his hand to her chest so he could feel her heart racing, or so she said. Every second of it felt like a reward for years of quiet devotion. He told her, honestly, that she mattered more to him than anything else in this collapsing world. She smiled, whispered for him to close his eyes, and told him just to enjoy it. Like an idiot in love, he obeyed. And that's when the baseball bat came down on the back of his skull. Everything went black in an instant, blood pooling beneath him on cold tile. Above him stood Hyona's real boyfriend, the man she'd actually been loyal to the entire time. She hadn't hesitated, hadn't flinched, hadn't cared even a little. While Hanfong's body twitched in agony, the two of them celebrated finding his stockpile of supplies. To them, he wasn't a person, he was inventory. As his consciousness slipped away for the final time, he made himself one promise. If he ever got another chance, he would never again let himself be used like a toy and thrown away. Darkness swallowed him whole, and something impossible happened next. He woke up drenched in sweat, in his own bed, in a world that was warm again. Confused, terrified, he checked his calendar with shaking hands. The date read June 28th, weeks before the apocalypse he remembered was supposed to begin. It hit him all at once. He had gone back in time, and he still had every memory of his death. Shock turned to disbelief. Disbelief turned to something colder and far more useful. Because this time, Hanfong wasn't going in blind. And that wasn't even the strangest part of waking up. His right hand was glowing red, faint and warm, like an ember refusing to die. He tried to ignore it, told himself his mind was playing tricks after everything he'd been through. Then he sneezed, and without thinking, his hand flashed a bright, vivid green. The light seemed to have a will of its own, and it was only getting stronger. Panic set in as the glow spiraled out of his control, draining something deep inside him. He collapsed into a chair, completely wiped out, wondering what kind of curse he'd brought back with him. Then a thought crossed his mind, one that felt almost embarrassing to admit. This was exactly like those stories he used to read, the ones where the hero gets reborn with power. Curious, despite himself, he grabbed a knife, hoping some kind of miracle would kick in. Nothing happened, the blade did nothing at all, and he felt like a complete fool standing there. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that surviving came before experimenting. He checked his fridge and found it nearly empty, a harsh reminder of how unprepared he still was. With no other options, he reached for a jar of roasted soybeans, the only snack left in the house. The moment a bean touched his lips, it burst into a full-grown, thriving plant. Light poured from his glowing green hand, and just like that, his exhaustion vanished completely. He stared at the sprouting beanstalk, stunned, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. Whatever this power was, it was tied to food, and that discovery alone could change everything. Impressed but overwhelmed, Hanfong knew he needed answers, and fast. But first, there was the small matter of preparing for an apocalypse he already knew was coming. He packed a bag and made his way through a crowded supermarket, weaving past people lost in their own worries. Nobody here had any idea what was about to hit them, and that ignorance would cost them dearly. While he shopped, his thoughts drifted back to his two colors of glowing light. Green seemed helpful, but unstable, draining him harder every time he pushed it too far. Then, right as he was deep in thought, a painfully familiar voice called out behind him. It was Hyiona, the same girl who had once led him to his death with a smile on her face. Every instinct told him to run, to keep his distance, to never trust that face again. He'd spent 3 years chasing her love in his old life, only to be repaid with a bat to the skull. Rage simmered under the surface, but Hanfong wasn't the type to explode carelessly. He reminded himself that revenge would come, but it had to come on his own terms this time. For now, he needed supplies more than he needed satisfaction. Hyiona reached for his arm, playing sweet and worried, asking why he seemed so distracted. He complimented her looks just enough to keep her guessing, and she took the bait instantly. She invited him shopping, expecting him to fold the way he always used to. Instead, he brushed her off completely, and her confidence cracked for the first time. She scoffed once he was gone, muttering that he was nothing but a broke loser anyway. Little did she know, this broke loser had just secured a massive government loan meant for crisis relief. After all, who worries about repaying debt when the whole world is about to end? With his shopping list handled and cash finally flowing, Hanfong hit the market hard. Just as Hyiona was busy insulting him under her breath, a car pulled up right beside her. Behind the wheel, unbelievably, was Hanfong himself, dressed sharp and acting completely unbothered. He casually explained the car was a gift, courtesy of his father working overseas. Her attitude flipped instantly, guilt and interest replacing her earlier scorn. She apologized for judging him, assuming he'd simply been busy with family matters. Then she turned on the waterworks, playing the victim like it was second nature to her. Hanfong played along perfectly, pulling her close and insisting she meant the world to him. She lit up instantly, convinced she'd won him back without even trying. He teased her with the promise of a gift, and she practically floated home with excitement. What she didn't know was that Hanfong wore the exact same satisfied smile the moment she turned her back. 2 players, 2 masks, and only one of them actually knew the game being played. Because deep down, Hanfong had already decided her fate the moment he woke up in this second life. When the real disaster hit, he intended to make her and her boyfriend pay for every second of his old death. For now, though, there was a countdown ticking, one only he could see. The apocalypse was scheduled to hit in exactly 2 weeks, and every hour mattered. Snow would fall first, gentle and deceiving, before the temperature nosedived toward oblivion. Within a month, the readings would crash towards 70 degrees below zero, burying the world in white. Stepping outside would become a death sentence, and food would become the only currency that mattered. Hanfong quietly hauled his supplies home under cover of darkness, hiding every trace of his preparation. He hired workers to reinforce his apartment, insulating every wall against the coming freeze. A private storage room held everything he needed, locked away from prying eyes. Piece by piece, his fortress was taking shape, and this time nobody was going to catch him off guard. With 1 day left before the world changed forever, only one problem remained unsolved. His strange, glowing powers were still a complete mystery, and mysteries could get a man killed. He knew relying on canned food alone wouldn't be enough to survive what was coming. So he turned to the one resource he actually understood, the very soybeans that started this whole mess. With trembling hands, he tested another spoonful, praying it wouldn't blow up in his face. Whatever answers were waiting inside that glowing light, Hanfong was about to find every single one of them. The beans didn't explode this time, and after finishing half the plate, nothing bad happened at all. That meant his power could grow food safely, but figuring out how it actually worked was another story entirely. Hour after hour, he tested it on random vegetables, chasing a pattern that refused to show itself. Some plants grew beautifully, others simply sat there, completely unaffected by the glow. And a disturbing few exploded violently, leaving nothing behind but stinking, blackened rock. Exhausted and half delirious, Hanfong eventually collapsed onto the kitchen floor from pure overexertion. When he came to, groggy and surrounded by ruined vegetables, one truth had crystallized in his mind. This power wasn't random at all, it was tied directly to his own focus, his own state of mind. He closed his eyes and pictured himself as one with nature, chasing that strange, meditative feeling. When he opened them again, his hand glowed a steady, confident green, exactly as he'd hoped. Encouraged, he pushed further and tried the ability on raw meat, hoping to expand his food options. The green light did nothing at all, leaving him staring at a slab of untouched beef in frustration. If meat was off the table, he'd be stuck eating plants for the rest of his life, and that thought terrified him. Remembering his second color, he shut his eyes again, this time reaching for the red. His palm ignited crimson, and the moment it touched the meat, something horrifying happened. The beef twisted and shriveled into a disgusting, spiky mass, barely recognizable as food anymore. Disgusted, he tossed it aside, but curiosity dragged him right back to inspect the mess. Poking at it carefully, he realized the meat wasn't cooking, it was doing the exact opposite. It was rotting, decomposing in fast motion, as if time itself had been forced into reverse. Green sped things up, red tore them down, 2 opposing forces trapped in the same pair of hands. An idea struck him instantly. What would happen if he combined both lights at once? He clasped his palms together over the ruined meat, and a burst of golden light erupted between them. When the glow faded, the meat had transformed into a massive, pristine slab, fresher than anything from a butcher shop. The soybeans he'd been holding had vanished entirely, apparently absorbed into the process itself. Hanfong stared at his hands in disbelief, realizing just how much potential he was sitting on. Eager to repeat the miracle, he tried again immediately, hungry for another success. This time, luck wasn't on his side, and the whole thing ended in total failure once more. Frustrated, he slammed his hand against the floor, but even failure taught him something valuable. With enough practice, this power could feed him for the rest of his life, no matter how bad things got. But food alone wouldn't keep him alive out there. He needed a way to protect himself too. Buying a weapon legally in this country was impossible, so he'd have to find another way in. Wandering the streets, he spotted a loud, obnoxious punk bragging about his gangster brother. The neighborhood had already given the guy a nickname, and not a flattering one, Homeless Joe. Sensing an opportunity, Hanfong approached him, pretending they were old acquaintances catching up. Joe fell for the act instantly, too proud to admit he had no memory of ever meeting him. Once the ice was broken, Hanfong spun a story about being jumped and beaten by a rival gang. He claimed he needed protection, a weapon, anything to keep from being humiliated again. Sympathetic and eager to prove his usefulness, Joe promised to bring him straight to his brother. That brother turned out to be a genuine gang leader, tattoos and all, running the block with an iron grip. The boss wasn't thrilled to see his embarrassing little brother tagging along uninvited. But when Joe insisted his friend needed a gun, the boss's irritation turned into curiosity. A cheap handgun was offered first, but Hanfong wasn't satisfied with something so weak. He pushed his luck and asked for a rifle instead, drawing an incredulous glare from the boss. That's when Joe unleashed another one of his ridiculous, over-the-top fabricated stories. By the time he finished, the boss was practically fuming with second-hand outrage on Hanfong's behalf. Against all odds, the request was approved, along with a free handgun tossed in as a bonus. In exchange, Hanfong quietly warned the boss about the extreme weather heading their way. He kept his tone serious enough to make the warning land, without revealing exactly how he knew. With weapons secured, and a gang leader now stockpiling supplies, Hanfong's plan was falling into place. On the way back, disaster struck in the most anticlimactic way imaginable. Hanfong slipped right in front of Joe and came crashing down hard. His leg twisted beneath him. A trip to the hospital confirmed the worst, a clean fracture that would take time to heal. While waiting for his medication, exhausted and irritated, he spotted someone who instantly caught his eye. She was the head nurse, impossibly young for the role, moving through the chaos with practiced grace. Her name was Jyn, kind to every patient, radiant even under fluorescent hospital lighting. While admiring her from a distance, he noticed something far less pleasant unfolding nearby. An elderly patient was taking advantage of her attentiveness, sneaking a photo up her skirt. Before things escalated further, the old man grabbed her inappropriately, thinking no one was watching. Hanfong wasn't about to let that slide, injured leg or not. He swung his crutch straight into the man's face, sending him sprawling to the floor. Jyn rushed over, startled, unaware that her rescuer had just fractured his own leg minutes earlier. Hanfong found the incriminating photo on the old man's phone and threatened to expose him publicly. The coward bolted from the hospital at a speed that defied his supposed back injury entirely. Grateful and a little embarrassed, Jyn properly bandaged his leg while thanking him repeatedly. For a brief moment, surrounded by her kindness, Hanfong almost let himself enjoy something simple, but reality crept back in fast, because he knew exactly what was coming in one short week. If everything played out like his last life, he might never get the chance to see her again. He left the hospital carrying that heavy thought, unable to shake the weight of it. The very next day, the news confirmed his worst fears were finally coming true. Temperatures were crashing across the globe, and cities that never saw snow were suddenly buried in it. Experts insisted the cold snap was temporary, a lie so familiar it made Hanfong want to laugh. He knew better than anyone that this wasn't a passing storm. It was the beginning of the end. While the world panicked, he sat comfortably in his reinforced apartment, warm and thoroughly unbothered. The building's group chat exploded with fear, confusion, and useless speculation about the weather. Then one anonymous message appeared, calmly stating the Ice Age had officially begun. Hanfong froze, staring at his screen, because that information wasn't supposed to exist yet. Someone else out there knew things they had absolutely no business knowing. If he wasn't the only person carrying knowledge of the future, then everything was far more dangerous than he'd planned for. Meanwhile, one resident named Jang stepped forward, urging neighbors to cooperate instead of panic. His calm leadership won people over instantly, though Hanfong recognized the pattern all too well. This so-called kindness had led straight to disaster in his previous life, and it would again. Hyiona, predictably, texted him begging for supplies, using her usual mix of guilt and flirtation. Hanfong ignored her completely, savoring every buzzing notification while enjoying a proper hot meal. Days passed with her growing increasingly desperate, until she finally climbed 16 flights of stairs to find him. Waiting in the dark stairwell for her arrival, Hanfong had prepared something special. A bag of flour came crashing down on her head the second she called out his name. Covered in white dust, humiliated and freezing, Hyona's carefully maintained mask started slipping. He handed over a second bag, this one filled with rotting, moldy garbage disguised as food. Starving and desperate enough to overlook the smell, she grabbed it and left without a word of thanks. Hanfong watched her go, feeling something close to satisfaction settle in his chest. But the night wasn't over yet, because someone had been quietly following him the entire time. He turned the tables and ambushed the shadow trailing him, ready to strike first. Instead of a threat, he found a strange, silent girl with messy hair and thick glasses. She refused to speak a single word, no matter how he pushed or threatened her. Eventually, she pulled him along by the sleeve, leading him straight to her own apartment. Inside was a warm, cluttered room stacked with boxes of supplies from floor to ceiling. It turned out she had predicted the apocalypse through calculations alone, no regression required. She was the anonymous voice from the group chat, the one who had unnerved him so badly. Screens lined her walls, all of them showing security footage, and every single camera was pointed at him. She'd been watching his every move, from delivered supplies to his mysterious gun case. Turns out she hadn't been spying to expose him, she'd been searching for someone worth trusting. She simply lacked the basic survival skills to make use of the resources she'd gathered. Reluctantly, Hanfong found himself teaching her how to run a generator, connect gas lines, and even cook. She introduced herself as Chuku, though calling her odd would be a massive understatement. Despite the headache she caused him daily, Hanfong quietly accepted that she wasn't leaving his life anytime soon. Down in the parking garage, however, the mood was turning uglier by the day. Starving residents began fighting over dwindling rations, fists flying over a single can of food. Jang stepped in, calm as ever, using a megaphone to blast the chaos into silence. With practiced ease, he twisted the narrative, blaming the wealthy for hoarding while the poor starved. The crowd ate up every word, their anger redirected exactly where Jang wanted it pointed. Hanfong watched from a distance, recognizing the exact same manipulation from his previous life. He knew this fake unity would eventually collapse into something far uglier. Then, without warning, the entire building lost power all at once. Panic spread instantly, because everyone understood this blackout might be permanent. Jang's followers, driven mad by desperation, began breaking into apartments to steal whatever they could find. Hanfong scrambled to rig his door with live wires, hoping to shock anyone foolish enough to force their way in. Before he could finish, someone was already knocking, and it was Chuku, asking for help. He warned her off, telling her to hide, but she refused to budge from his doorway. Outside, raiders were tearing through the 18th floor, smashing every lock they came across. Hanfong pulled Chuku inside and covered her mouth, praying his reinforced door would hold. The raiders tried everything, but 5 centimeters of iron plating refused to give an inch. Frustrated, they moved on, unaware how close they'd come to a much worse surprise. With Chuku's help, Hanfong finally finished wiring his door trap, ready for the next intruder. She calmly explained that electrical work was second nature to her, one of her few useful talents. Testing his newest power out of frustration, Hanfong stumbled and accidentally touched his coffee table. Instead of pain, he felt nothing, and the table had turned soft as clay beneath his palm. A brand new purple light was dancing across his hand, one he'd never noticed before. He tested it on metal tools, watching them bend and warp like they were made of rubber. Curious, he combined purple with green, and the softened object hardened back up, tougher than before. This new ability could reinforce anything he touched, turning ordinary materials into something nearly indestructible. The timing couldn't have been better, because someone was about to test that theory the hard way. Hyiona showed up at his door again, tears streaming, begging to be let inside. Hanfong recognized the scene immediately. This was the exact moment leading to his death in his old life. Somewhere in the darkness outside, her boyfriend was waiting with a weapon, just like before. This time, though, Hanfong had knowledge, patience, and powers his old self never possessed. He carefully traced the wall, estimating exactly where the killer was hiding behind it. Coating his hand in purple light, he softened the wall until a hidden weapon emerged from within it. With one precise strike, a sledgehammer shot straight through the softened wall and shattered the killer's jaw. Hyiona screamed in shock as her partner crumpled, completely blindsided by the ambush. Hanfong burst through his own front door, fire extinguisher in hand, coating her in white foam. For a moment, he had both of them exactly where he wanted them, helpless and terrified. Hyiona slipped free at the last second, losing a fistful of hair as she scrambled away, screaming. Her boyfriend wasn't nearly as fortunate, and Hanfong's rage had been building for an entire lifetime. He beat the man mercilessly, every punch fueled by memories of his own murder. Finally, he grabbed the very bat that had once ended his life, and brought it down with everything he had. The sound that followed marked the end of one debt, finally repaid in full. Shaking, adrenaline draining from his body, Hanfong nearly vomited at the sight of what he'd done. Chuku sat quietly nearby, unbothered by the blood, and calmly offered to help clean up the mess. He tried convincing her to leave for her own safety, but she refused without hesitation. She insisted her own strange power would keep them both protected, no matter what came next. Then she showed him something through a doorway that left him utterly speechless. Down at the parking garage, Hyiona rejoined the food line, humiliated and utterly friendless. Her wealthy sponsor was gone, and rumors about Hanfong's hidden resources only deepened her bitterness. A creep from the crowd cornered her, threatening to expose her for stealing rations she wasn't owed. Before things turned violent, Nurse Jyn stepped in and sent the creep flying with a single powerful slap. The commotion drew Jang's attention, and he arrived just in time to smooth things over publicly. He offered both Jyn and Brother Lee spots within his growing committee, hoping to add their strength. Both of them refused outright, unwilling to be part of something built on theft and manipulation. Desperate for status, Hyiona clung to Jang's arm, begging to be included, despite her uselessness. He coldly rejected her too, stating plainly that the committee only wanted people with actual value. Humiliated once again, she scrambled to think of anything that might make herself useful to him. Back upstairs, Hanfong was busy exploring an entirely new discovery inside Chuku's strange dimensional space. She revealed she could open a black hole capable of storing nearly unlimited amounts of supplies. Curious, Hanfong stuck his head inside, only to realize a horrifying detail seconds too late. There was no oxygen inside that endless void, and he yanked himself free, gasping desperately for air. Once he recovered, they used her storage to pull out drones and remote-controlled toys for surveillance. Their timing proved perfect, because raiders were already creeping up the stairwell toward their floor. Hanfong rigged small explosives onto the toy cars, using them as a blinding distraction for the intruders. The plan worked beautifully, scattering the raiders in a panic, though their prized drone was eventually lost in the chaos. Scanning the wreckage through their remaining camera feed, they spotted something alarming below. A body lay motionless on the icy stairs, and it looked disturbingly like Brother Lee. Without hesitation, Hanfong grabbed his gun and descended into the freezing stairwell to find his friend. Along the way, he crossed paths with an intimidating, gray-bearded old man who dragged him into a dark room. The old stranger demanded answers, threatening violence if Hanfong dared to lie about his motives. With no other choice, Hanfong spilled a mix of truth and carefully placed lies about his conflict with Jang. The old man, it turned out, had his own bitter grudge against the very same committee. He revealed there was a hidden secret buried deep within Jang's operation, one worth killing for. Their conversation was interrupted when guards began flooding the area, forcing a daring escape through a window. With snowfall piled high enough to cushion the fall, both men leapt from the 8th floor without hesitation. They landed hard but alive, disappearing into the storm before anyone could catch them. Once safely hidden, the old man introduced himself properly as Young Hao, a man waging his own war against Jang. He explained that Jang had been abandoning the sick and elderly to conserve resources for his loyal followers. A rival faction of boxers had already formed in opposition, and tensions were reaching a boiling point. Young Hao proposed a temporary alliance, and though wary, Hanfong recognized the value in joining forces. Meanwhile, Brother Lee had discovered something disturbing, hidden deep within the second basement level. Behind a hidden tunnel, he found crates of unmarked food, stacked high and carefully guarded. Before he could investigate further, he was captured, beaten, and thrown into a holding room. Hanfong tracked him down and freed him, only to learn Jang had quietly ordered his execution. The committee's righteous mask was slipping fast, revealing the rot festering underneath. With Chuku's help, the trio devised a daring plan to expose Jang's secret warehouse to everyone. They staged a fake supply raid, deliberately emptying their own apartment to lure the raiders into a trap. When the committee's forces broke through, they found nothing but garbage, humiliating Jang in front of his followers. Hyiona, having tipped them off in the first place, took the brunt of the blame for the failure. Jang, desperate to save face, extended yet another invitation for Hanfong to join his cause. Hanfong accepted nothing, but he now had exactly what he needed: insider knowledge of Jang's crumbling empire. With the committee's trust shaken, the trio infiltrated the upper floors under the cover of the chaos. They discovered a suspiciously obvious fake warehouse, rigged with tripwires meant to catch intruders. Narrowly avoiding capture, they retreated further upward, only to run straight into Jang himself. Hanfong pressed a gun to the back of his skull, ready to finally end things once and for all. Jang smiled, revealing he'd planted a hidden recorder inside the returned pistol, exposing every move Hanfong made. Special Forces soldiers stormed the scene, forcing Hanfong to flee under a hail of gunfire. In the chaos, a grenade landed directly beside him, and the resulting blast tore through his entire body. Death should have been instant, but his powers had other plans entirely. His body knit itself back together automatically, though his consciousness slipped somewhere far away from control. What followed was less of a rescue and more of a slaughter carried out by instinct alone. With red light devouring everything in his path, armored vehicles crumbled and enemy soldiers froze solid. Purple light melted steel like wax, trapping men inside metal that hardened around their screaming bodies. By the time his rampage ended, Hanfong collapsed unconscious, completely unaware of the carnage he'd unleashed. Jung Hao stepped in just in time, fending off the final attacker before dragging his unconscious partner to safety. When Hanfong finally woke, he had no memory of the massacre, only fragments of the grenade's explosion. Jung Hao filled in the gaps, revealing that Jang's committee was trading residents to a mysterious outside faction. Under interrogation, a captured soldier confessed that this so-called safe haven was anything but safe. The living were being fed to something far worse, and Hanfong felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. With this horrifying discovery, staying hidden was no longer an option. They needed a plan of escape. Regrouping with Nurse Jyn and Chuku, Hanfong revealed everything they'd learned about Jang's true intentions. Together, they uncovered a massive tunnel dug beneath the parking garage, leading toward parts unknown. Whatever had carved that passage clearly wasn't human, and that thought alone was terrifying enough. Deciding caution outweighed curiosity, the group prepared properly before daring to explore any further. Hanfong and Brother Li ventured into the tunnel together, leaving the girls safely behind. The underground maze stretched endlessly, branching in directions that led absolutely nowhere useful. Eventually, they stumbled upon a hidden path that surfaced deep inside enemy territory, a place called Han City. What they found there confirmed their worst fears, an entire district under total military control. Suddenly, the ground erupted as a massive, childlike figure burst through solid concrete without warning. This creature, oversized and unnervingly strong, had clearly been the one responsible for digging the tunnels. Spotted and pursued, the duo barely escaped through collapsing passageways, choking on falling debris. Hanfong bought precious time by softening the tunnel floor, trapping their pursuer momentarily in place. Brother Li, in a burst of misguided bravery, abandoned the escape to help fight, only making things worse. Forced to flee once more, they eventually shook the creature and stumbled their way back toward the surface. Emerging into a frozen, unfamiliar landscape, they realized they'd traveled far further from home than intended. With no tunnels left to guide them, their only choice now was a long, dangerous trek above ground. Meanwhile, back at their apartment, disaster struck the moment they were gone. The same lumbering creature tracked them down and smashed straight through their reinforced door with ease. Jung Hao shielded the girls as best he could, but there was no outrunning something that powerful. Quick thinking from Nurse Jyn bought them a narrow escape, though Jung Hao stayed behind to cover their retreat. The girls leapt from the building entirely, saved only by Chuku's storage full of cushioning supplies. Down below, Hanfong barely had time to process their sudden, chaotic reunion before the creature arrived again. Thinking fast, he hurled a bag of soybeans directly into its gaping mouth, triggering rapid, violent growth. Vines exploded from its throat, choking it long enough for the group to scatter and disappear. With the beast subdued, the real threat revealed itself, a hardened military captain hunting them relentlessly. He paraded a captured, badly beaten Jung Hao through the streets, using him as bait to lure Hanfong out. Refusing to abandon their ally, the group devised a chaotic rescue plan using scattered supplies as a distraction. While soldiers scrambled for the sudden bounty raining from the sky, Hanfong plowed through the chaos in a stolen bulldozer. He flattened the massive creature with brute mechanical force before scooping up the injured old man to safety. The escape was chaotic and desperate, but against all odds, the entire group made it out alive together. Running low on fuel, Hanfong improvised using his powers to convert failed meat experiments into makeshift fuel. It was disgusting, but it worked, keeping the bulldozer running long enough to reach their next destination. They finally arrived at an abandoned hillside villa, defensible, isolated, and untouched by the chaos below. Exhausted beyond words, the group collapsed inside, grateful simply to be warm and alive again. It didn't take long before the villa started feeling less like a hideout and more like an actual home. With electricity restored, video games running, and a bath finally within reach, spirits lifted considerably. Hanfong even discovered his red light could rapidly heat water, solving their frozen pipe problem entirely. For the first time in weeks, the group experienced something dangerously close to comfort. Jung Hao, healing steadily, confessed he'd once been planning to leave once his mission was complete. Hanfong shut that conversation down fast, uninterested in dragging himself into anyone else's complicated business. Still, fate had other plans, because a familiar face soon stumbled, half-frozen, toward their fortress. It was Chang, one of Director Lu's men, the very gangster who had once sold Hanfong his weapons. Chang explained that their compound had been attacked, and the director himself had been captured alive. Brother Li, forever loyal, immediately insisted they organize a rescue no matter the risk involved. Jung Hao revealed his own connection to the director, a debt from his past life as a fighter. Together, the three of them prepared to leave, while Hanfong chose to stay behind and hold the fort. He wasn't about to risk everything for a stranger, no matter how noble the cause sounded. With the trio departed, Hanfong installed more cameras, determined to keep the villa airtight and secure. Days passed peacefully enough, filled with gardening experiments and increasingly creative uses of his abilities. He learned to grow vegetables using controlled bursts of green light, though failures still turned crops into coal. Nurse Jyn taught him proper gardening techniques, blending science with his unpredictable, glowing powers. Together, they dug an entire underground greenhouse, using his red light's newly discovered demolition ability. Progress was slow but steady, and their first successful harvest felt like a genuine victory. Just as things settled into a rhythm, distant explosions began echoing across the frozen hills. At first dismissed as unrelated conflict, the blasts grew louder and closer with every passing day. Determined to protect their home, the group built a massive ice wall, thick enough to withstand debris. It held, barely, as explosions crept dangerously close to their once peaceful hideaway. Fed up with hiding, Hanfong grabbed his sniper rifle and ventured out to confront the source directly. What he found waiting on the other side of that mountain would test every ounce of power he possessed. Following the trail of destruction, he discovered a hidden military complex tucked deep inside the icy cliffs. Soldiers moved cautiously toward the entrance, clearly terrified of something waiting inside those walls. Before they could even breach the doorway, an invisible force sent every last one of them flying. From the wreckage emerged three figures who didn't look human at all in the way they moved. A little girl carrying a bazooka, a boy with an eerily calm expression, and a striking woman with piercing purple eyes. For one unnerving second, that woman looked directly at Hanfong's hiding spot and smiled. He'd never felt fear like that before, not even facing down a gun in his own doorway. Before he could react, the little girl aimed her weapon and blew apart the exact hill he was standing on. He barely escaped the blast, sliding down the slope as gunfire and explosions consumed the battlefield behind him. The boy's power proved even more terrifying, twisting mountains of snow into a deadly, crushing avalanche. Hanfong barely dug himself free, dragging an unconscious soldier along with him through the freezing debris. Interrogating the man revealed the horrifying truth about these three, each one impossibly overpowered in their own right. The woman could unleash devastating force with a single gesture, scattering entire battalions like leaves. The girl turned anything she touched into a living bomb, delighting in every explosion she caused. And the boy commanded ice and snow itself, making him nearly impossible to fight in this frozen world. Whoever these three were, they weren't simply passing through, they were hunting something specific. And that something, Hanfong realized with dawning horror, might just be him. He released the soldier, only to watch him get obliterated the second he stepped into open ground. These monsters weren't just powerful, they were precise, methodical, and utterly merciless in their pursuit. Hanfong barely managed to shield himself from the follow-up barrage, his defenses straining against the relentless assault. Back at their hidden base, the woman calmly noted that their target's power signature hadn't weakened at all. If anything, whoever they were chasing had grown stronger with every explosion thrown their way. That single detail was enough to convince her they weren't dealing with an ordinary survivor. She ordered another wave of bombs, refusing to let a potential threat like this simply walk away. Back in his hideout, Hanfong slumped into a chair, adrenaline finally giving way to bone-deep exhaustion. He understood now that running wouldn't be enough, not against enemies who could track power itself. If he returned home now, the bombs would eventually follow him straight to everyone he cared about. For the first time since waking up in this second life, Hanfong genuinely considered striking first. 3 against 1 sounded like suicide, but so had surviving an Ice Age apocalypse the second time around. He thought back to everything that had brought him here. Every death, every betrayal, every second chance earned. The old Hanfong would have hidden, prayed, and waited for the storm to simply pass him by. That version of him had died on a cold apartment floor, unmourned and completely forgotten. This version of him had clawed his way back from nothing, and he refused to lose it all now. Somewhere out there, Yoonghao, Brother Lee, and Nurse Jyn were still fighting their own battles for survival. And back at the villa, Chuku was waiting, trusting him to come home in one piece. He thought of Hyiona too, the girl who'd once killed him without a second thought. Karma had already found her once, humiliated and abandoned, exactly where she deserved to be. This time, though, the threat wasn't personal betrayal. It was something far bigger than one grudge. An entire faction of unknown, overwhelming power now stood between him and any hope of peace. He flexed his glowing hands, feeling the familiar hum of red, green, and purple light waiting beneath his skin. Whatever this new world threw at him, he had survived death once already, and he intended to do it again. Slowly, deliberately, Hanfong rose to his feet and began mapping out his next move. He couldn't take all three of them head-on, not yet, not with power this raw and untested. But patience had always been his greatest weapon, sharper even than the guns in his stockpile. In his first life, he'd waited too long and paid with everything he had. In this one, he refused to make the same mistake twice. For now, survival meant retreating carefully, gathering strength, and choosing his battles with precision. The apocalypse had already taken his old life once, and it wasn't getting a second chance to finish the job. Every scar, every fight, every impossible power he'd uncovered had been building toward this exact moment. The Ice Age had turned neighbors into monsters and monsters into rulers of a frozen world. But it had also forged something out of Hanfong that no one, not even he, expected to find. A man who refused to be prey ever again, no matter how powerful the predators became. Somewhere down that frozen mountain, 3 impossible superhumans were still searching for him. And somewhere up in that fortified villa, a strange little family was waiting for him to come home. Both of those worlds now depended entirely on choices only he could make. He thought about his first death often, the cold floor, the mocking laughter, the total absence of anyone caring. That memory used to fuel his rage, but lately, it fueled something steadier instead, purpose. Because revenge alone couldn't build a fortress, and it definitely couldn't grow a garden underground. Somewhere between betrayal and rebirth, Hanfong had built something worth protecting, whether he'd meant to or not. Brother Lee's loyalty, forged over shared cigarettes and reckless bravery, had become unexpectedly precious to him. Nurse Jyn's quiet strength, both physical and emotional, reminded him that kindness hadn't died with the old world. Even Chuku, strange and silent as she was, had carved out her own permanent place in his life. Junghao's stubborn honor, hardened by years in the ring, had taught him that trust could still be earned. None of these people owed him anything, yet all of them had chosen to stand beside him anyway. That, more than any glowing power, felt like the real miracle of his second chance. Down the mountain, the explosions continued, distant reminders that peace in this frozen world never lasted long. But Hanfong no longer felt like the helpless victim who once opened his door without hesitation. He was a man who had died, remembered everything, and rebuilt himself from the frozen ground up. Every trap he'd built, every ability he'd mastered, every ally he'd earned had prepared him for exactly this test. The 3 superhumans hunting him didn't know it yet, but they'd just made a very costly mistake. They'd bombed the wrong hillside, chased the wrong survivor, and underestimated a man who refused to stay dead. With that thought settling firmly in his chest, Hanfong checked his weapons, steadied his breathing, and planned his retreat. Retreat wasn't defeat, not for a man who had already turned death itself into a stepping stone. He would return to his fortress, regroup with his family, and prepare for whatever came next. Because if this world had taught him anything, it was that survival belonged to those who adapted fastest. And Hanfong, quite literally reborn from the ashes of his own failure, had adapted better than anyone. As he began the long trek back through the freezing wasteland, snow swirling violently around him, his resolve hardened. The apocalypse hadn't broken him, it had built him, piece by painful piece, into something unstoppable. Whatever waited for him at that hillside villa, he intended to protect it with everything he now had. And whoever those 3 monsters were, they would soon learn exactly what it meant to hunt a man twice. Behind him, the military complex burned in the distance, a warning sign of the war still raging. Ahead of him, warmth, family, and a fragile peace waited, fragile only because he hadn't finished protecting it yet. With each frozen step forward, Hanfong carried the weight of 2 lifetimes, one lost, one hard won. The boy who died confused and betrayed on his own apartment floor no longer existed. In his place walked a survivor, a protector, and quietly, a man capable of terrifying power. Somewhere behind those distant mountains, 3 overwhelming enemies were still searching, still hunting, still underestimating him. Let them come, he thought, because this time, he wasn't the one who'd be caught off guard. This time, when the trap sprang shut, it wouldn't be his blood spilled across the ice. He had built walls strong enough to survive bombs, powers strong enough to level buildings, and bonds strong enough to matter. That combination, forged entirely from his own suffering, made him far more dangerous than anyone realized. The wind howled around him as he pressed forward, each breath crystallizing in the brutal cold. Somewhere ahead, warmth and family waited, and nothing in this frozen hell would keep him from reaching them. Not the committee, not the raiders, not the military, and certainly not 3 strangers with borrowed godlike power. Every step brought him closer to home, and every step also brought him closer to whatever war came next. He thought briefly of Hyiona, wondering if she'd survive the humiliation of her own greed and betrayal. Wherever she ended up, it no longer mattered to him, because he had already reclaimed everything she'd once stolen. His time, his trust, his very life, all of it belonged fully to him now, and to no one else. The frozen world outside might still be falling apart, but inside him, something had finally settled into place. Not peace exactly, but purpose, sharp and steady, guiding every decision he made from here on out. He thought of Jang too, still ruling his crumbling committee through fear and carefully manufactured lies. Empires built on manipulation always collapsed eventually, and Hanfong intended to make sure this one did too. But that battle would wait for another day, because tonight, survival meant getting home safely. Climbing the final stretch toward the hillside villa, exhaustion pulled hard against every aching muscle in his body. Through the swirling snow, the faint glow of the villa's windows finally came into view. Relief flooded through him instantly, warm and overwhelming, the closest thing to comfort this frozen world offered. He pushed open the reinforced gate, and immediately, Chuku's blank stare greeted him from the doorway. She didn't smile, didn't cheer, but she quietly stepped aside to let him in, and that was enough. Inside, warmth wrapped around him instantly, chasing away the brutal cold that had followed him for hours. He collapsed onto the couch, utterly spent, but alive, and for now that victory felt monumental. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new enemies, and new choices demanding everything he had left to give. Tonight, though, Hanfong allowed himself one simple, hard-earned moment of peace. He had died once, powerless and betrayed, at the mercy of people who never valued him. He had returned stronger, smarter, and utterly unwilling to ever be that helpless again. The Ice Age had stolen the old world completely, but it had also given him the tools to rebuild. Every glowing light in his hands represented a lesson paid for in blood, failure, and stubborn persistence. Every ally standing beside him represented trust rebuilt from the wreckage of his shattered first life. And every enemy defeated so far had only proven one undeniable truth about the man he'd become. Hanfong was no longer someone the world could simply use up and throw away. He was someone the world would now have to reckon with, one frozen battle at a time. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent to the small victories and quiet triumphs happening within those walls. But inside that fortified villa, warmth, loyalty, and hard-earned strength stood firm against the endless winter. And that, more than any single power, was the true weapon Hanfong had built for himself. The next morning arrived cold and clear, sunlight glinting harshly off endless fields of snow. Hanfong woke to the smell of something cooking, proof that Nurse Jyn and the others had made it home safely too. Relief hit him hard as he descended the stairs and found the whole group gathered around the fireplace. Brother Lee bore fresh bruises but wore them proudly, recounting their successful rescue of Director Liu in vivid detail. Jung Hao looked older somehow, worn down but satisfied, having paid off one of his oldest debts. The director himself, grateful beyond words, pledged his loyalty and resources to their growing little alliance. For the first time in weeks, their small family felt complete, gathered safely under one roof. Hanfong shared what he'd discovered on the mountain, describing the 3 terrifying superhumans without holding back details. The room fell silent, absorbing the weight of a threat far greater than Jang's crumbling committee ever posed. Jung Hao, ever the strategist, insisted they needed information before they needed a plan of attack. Director Liu offered his remaining network of contacts, promising to dig up whatever intelligence still existed. Nurse Jyn, practical as always, focused on reinforcing their medical supplies for whatever conflict lay ahead. Chuku simply nodded and returned to her endless inventory, quietly preparing for a war none of them could avoid. Hanfong looked around at each of them, and something in his chest settled, heavy but steady. This wasn't the isolated fortress of a man hiding from the world anymore. It was a home worth defending. Over the following days, the group fortified the villa further, expecting retaliation from the military faction eventually. Traps were laid, walls thickened, and supply lines carefully hidden beneath layers of snow and ice. Hanfong practiced his powers relentlessly, pushing the limits of red, green, and purple light every single day. Slowly, painfully, he began stringing his abilities together into something closer to genuine combat mastery. Brother Lee trained alongside him, insisting that raw muscle still counted for something in this new world. Jung Hao took it upon himself to teach proper hand-to-hand combat, refusing to let talent go to waste. Even Nurse Jyn joined in occasionally, her monstrous strength making her an unexpectedly terrifying training partner. Bit by bit, their ragtag group of survivors began transforming into something far more dangerous, a real team. Down in the ruins of the old neighborhood, Jang's committee continued crumbling under the weight of its own lies. Without Hyeona's usefulness or Hanfong's stockpile to exploit, his influence weakened with every passing day. Rumors spread of internal fighting, of hungry followers finally questioning the man who had promised them salvation. Hanfong received updates through Director Lu's network, watching from a distance as his old enemy slowly unraveled. He felt no urgency to finish that fight personally, not while a far greater threat loomed over the mountains. Karma, it seemed, was more than capable of handling Jang without any further help from him. Meanwhile, whispers began circulating about the woman with purple eyes and her two terrifying companions. Survivors spoke of entire military outposts wiped out overnight, their soldiers vanished without explanation. It became clear that Hanfong wasn't their only target, they were sweeping the region for any sign of resistance. That realization only reinforced what Hanfong already suspected. Hiding forever was never going to be an option. Eventually, they would come looking for him again, and next time, running might not be enough. So instead of waiting passively, the group began gathering intelligence of their own, mapping enemy movements carefully. Chuku's cameras extended their reach further into the frozen wilderness, watching every road and ridge for danger. Slowly, a picture began forming, one that suggested even the terrifying trio answered to someone higher up. Whatever organization controlled them clearly had ambitions far beyond one collapsing apartment complex or one stubborn survivor. This ice age wasn't just a natural disaster anymore, it was becoming a battlefield for power itself. And Hanfong, once a helpless victim, with nothing but memories of his own death, now stood right in the middle of it. Weeks passed in careful preparation, the villa transforming into something closer to a proper stronghold. Supplies grew, defenses strengthened, and their small family of survivors grew tighter with every shared meal. Hanfong often found himself standing on the rooftop at night, watching the distant glow of military fires burning. Somewhere out there, the woman with purple eyes was still searching, patient and utterly convinced of her own power. Somewhere out there, the boy who commanded ice and snow waited quietly for his next target. And somewhere out there, a little girl with a bazooka dreamed of the next explosion she'd get to create. Hanfong wasn't afraid of them anymore. Not the way he'd been on that mountainside, exposed and unprepared. He was studying them now, learning their patterns, preparing the same way he'd once prepared for the entire apocalypse. Because if there was one lesson his first death had truly taught him, it was this simple, brutal truth. Preparation always beat panic, and knowledge always outlasted fear, no matter how powerful the enemy seemed. Brother Lee often joked that their little hillside villa had become the safest place left in the entire frozen world. Nurse Jyn quietly agreed, grateful every single day that she'd chosen to trust a stranger with a broken leg. Jung Hao, hardened by decades in the ring, admitted this found family was the closest thing to peace he'd known in years. Even Chuku, silent and strange as ever, seemed to smile a little more with each passing week. Director Lu's men patrolled the surrounding hills, expanding their territory carefully, one secured outpost at a time. Slowly, methodically, Hanfong's little corner of the apocalypse was becoming something the old world might have called a civilization. Not perfect, not safe from every threat, but built on trust instead of manipulation, on loyalty instead of fear. It was everything Jang's committee had promised and failed to deliver, built quietly by people who actually meant it. Hanfong understood now that survival was never just about food, weapons, or glowing, unpredictable powers. It was about who stood beside you when the temperature dropped low enough to kill everyone else around you. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, bleeding out on a cold apartment floor, betrayed by someone he'd trusted completely. This time, he made sure every single person standing beside him had earned that trust through action, not empty words. And that difference, more than any regression or glowing hand, was what truly separated his two lives apart. One life ended in betrayal and silence, the last thing he saw a stranger's face full of contempt. The other life, this life, was filled with people who fought beside him, healed him, and refused to leave him behind. That alone made every frozen night, every brutal fight, and every impossible power worth every ounce of struggle. As winter deepened and the world outside grew colder still, their little fortress only burned brighter with warmth inside. Hanfong knew the peace wouldn't last forever, not with enemies like Jang, the military, and 3 impossible superhumans still circling. But for now, surrounded by the family he'd built from nothing, he allowed himself to simply exist without fear. It was a rare gift in this frozen apocalypse, and he intended to protect it with everything he had left. Late one evening, gathered around the fireplace, the group shared stories of their old lives before the ice came. Brother Lee bragged, as always, about deals and connections that grew more exaggerated with every retelling. Nurse Jyn spoke softly about the patients she'd lost, and the ones she'd fought desperately to save. Jung Hao remained quiet mostly, though occasionally a flicker of his old championship glory slipped through. Chuku, unusually talkative that night, admitted she'd been utterly alone before the calculations revealed the coming disaster. Hanfong listened to each story carefully, realizing how much he genuinely cared about the people surrounding him now. When it came his turn, he stayed quiet about the regression, the death, the betrayal that started it all. Some truths, he decided, were better carried alone, protecting the fragile peace they'd all worked so hard to build. Instead, he simply said that he'd been given a second chance, and he intended to make it count. No one pressed him further, sensing there was more beneath the surface than he was ready to share. That quiet understanding, unspoken but deeply felt, was exactly the kind of trust his old life had never offered him. As the fire crackled and the storm howled outside, Hanfong finally allowed himself to feel something close to hope. Not naive optimism, but earned confidence, built through failure, power, loss, and hard-won victory in equal measure. The frozen world outside remained as dangerous as ever, filled with monsters both human and otherwise. But inside these walls, surrounded by people who had chosen him, chosen this family, Hanfong finally felt like he belonged. That feeling, more than any glowing light or hidden power, was the thing worth fighting hardest to protect. Somewhere beyond the mountains, threats continued gathering, patient and merciless, waiting for their moment to strike. But for tonight, the fire burned warm, the walls held strong, and the family inside remained safely together. Hanfong closed his eyes, letting the exhaustion of 2 lifetimes finally settle into something resembling rest. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new dangers, and new tests of everything he'd built since waking from his own death. Tonight, though, surrounded by warmth, loyalty, and the quiet crackle of fire against endless frozen silence, that was enough. He had died once with nothing, forgotten and discarded by people who never valued what he offered. He had lived again with everything, forged from loss, built through struggle, and surrounded by people who finally did. Whatever came next, whatever monsters waited beyond those frozen mountains, Hanfong would face them exactly the way he'd faced everything else. Prepared, unafraid, and absolutely unwilling to ever be helpless again. Days later, word finally arrived through Director Lu's network about the true nature of the enemy hunting them. The woman with purple eyes commanded far more than 3 superhumans. She led an entire organization built on conquest. Their goal, disturbingly simple, was to gather the strong and erase anyone who dared to resist their control. Hanfong understood now that this fight was never going to end quietly, tucked away in one hidden villa. Eventually, every safe haven left in this frozen world would be forced to choose a side. Rather than wait for that choice to be made for him, Hanfong decided it was time to prepare properly. He gathered his allies, laid out everything they'd learned, and asked a simple, difficult question. Were they willing to stand together against an enemy far more powerful than anything they'd faced before? One by one, without hesitation, every single person in that room answered with a resolute yes. Brother Lee cracked his knuckles, insisting he'd fought worse odds for far less worthy causes. Nurse Jyn simply nodded, her quiet determination speaking louder than any grand declaration ever could. Jung Hao smiled faintly, admitting he'd been waiting for a fight worthy of his old championship legacy. Chuku, expressionless as ever, opened her storage and began pulling out weapons they hadn't even known she possessed. Director Lu pledged his men, his resources, and his unwavering loyalty to the cause they now shared. Looking around at every determined face, Hanfong felt something settle deep within his chest, steady and unshakable. This wasn't the desperate scramble of a man trying only to survive one more frozen night. This was the beginning of something far greater, a family choosing to fight for the world they'd built together. Over the following weeks, they trained relentlessly, sharpened their strategies, and expanded their reach across the frozen territory. News of Jang's committee finally collapsing reached them, its followers scattering, its leader disappearing into obscurity entirely. One threat, at least, had crumbled under the weight of its own corruption, exactly as karma always intended. Hyiona, last seen begging for scraps among strangers who no longer recognized her value, vanished from every rumor entirely. Whatever became of her, Hanfong no longer felt the need to know, his debt to her fully repaid long ago. With one chapter closed, the group turned their full attention toward the mountains, and the monsters waiting within them. Hanfong continued refining his abilities daily, combining red, green, and purple light in ways he never imagined possible. He discovered new applications constantly, healing wounds faster, reinforcing structures stronger, and controlling his own power with growing precision. Brother Lee's fighting improved dramatically under Jung Hao's relentless, brutal training regimen. Nurse Jyn balanced her medical duties with combat practice, becoming both healer and warrior in equal measure. Chuku's mysterious storage revealed new surprises constantly, each discovery making their small army increasingly formidable. Slowly, their hidden villa transformed from a simple hideout into the beating heart of genuine resistance. Survivors from surrounding areas, hearing whispers of their fair treatment, began seeking refuge within their growing territory. Unlike Jang's twisted committee, Hanfong's group offered protection without exploitation, shelter without hidden cost. Word spread quickly through the frozen wasteland, and their numbers grew steadily with every passing week. What started as one man's desperate second chance had slowly become a genuine sanctuary in a broken world. Hanfong watched it all unfold with quiet disbelief, remembering a time when he'd trusted absolutely no one. Now, an entire community depended on his leadership, his powers, and the family he'd unexpectedly built around himself. The weight of that responsibility settled heavily some nights, but never heavily enough to make him regret it. Because every life saved, every family reunited, every meal shared felt like a direct answer to his own murder. He had died once, discarded and forgotten by people who saw him only as useful inventory. Now, he lived surrounded by people who saw him as something else entirely, a protector, a leader, a friend. That transformation, more than any glowing power, remained the true miracle of his second chance at life. As their strength grew, so did their resolve to eventually confront the threat, still circling somewhere beyond the mountain. Hanfong knew that day would come eventually, and when it did, he intended to be ready for it. Not the frightened, powerless man who once opened his door without hesitation, trusting blindly in false affection, but a man forged by betrayal, tempered by loss, and strengthened by every single soul who chose to stand beside him. The Ice Age had taken everything from the world once, stripping away comfort, safety, and blind trust in strangers. But it had also revealed something valuable buried beneath the frozen ruins, the true worth of genuine loyalty. Hanfong understood now that surviving the apocalypse was never really about outsmarting the cold or hoarding enough supplies. It was about who you chose to become when everything familiar collapsed around you completely. He had chosen protection over exploitation, loyalty over manipulation, and family over isolation, every single time it mattered. That choice, repeated again and again through betrayal, battle, and impossible power, had shaped him into someone unrecognizable from before. The frightened, love-struck fool who once died on his own apartment floor no longer existed in any meaningful way. In his place stood a leader, hardened by grief but softened by genuine connection, ready for whatever came next. Whatever the woman with purple eyes and her two terrifying companions were planning, they would find him ready this time. Not alone, not unprepared, and certainly not defenseless against whatever power they thought made them untouchable. Because behind Hanfong now stood an entire family, forged in fire, ice, and hard-earned trust. And that family, more than any single glowing ability, was the true strength no enemy could ever take away from him. One quiet evening, watching the sunset paint the frozen mountains in soft, fading orange light, Hanfong finally allowed himself to reflect. He thought back to that first cold morning, waking up drenched in sweat, terrified and utterly confused by his own survival. He thought of every failure along the way, the exploded soybeans, the ruined meat, the countless collapsed experiments. Each failure, frustrating as it had felt in the moment, had built toward the strength he now carried so easily. He thought of Brother Lee's ridiculous stories, Nurse Jyn's quiet kindness, and Jung Hao's hard-earned wisdom. He thought of Chuku, strange and silent, who had somehow become as close to family as anyone he'd ever known. Every person, every power, every hard-won victory had led him exactly here, standing stronger than he'd ever imagined possible. The apocalypse hadn't just tested his survival, it had revealed exactly who he was capable of becoming. And what he'd become, against every impossible odds stacked against him, was someone worth trusting completely. That truth mattered more to him now than any revenge he'd once craved against the people who had wronged him. Revenge had been his first motivation, cold and sharp, driving him through those early, uncertain days of his second life. But somewhere along the way, that motivation had quietly transformed into something far more meaningful and lasting. Purpose had replaced vengeance, family had replaced isolation, and genuine hope had replaced bitter, hollow anger. Hanfong smiled softly, watching the last light of day disappear behind the frozen peaks in the distance. Somewhere out there, danger still waited, patient and powerful, ready to test everything he'd built so carefully. But for the first time since waking up in this second chance at life, he felt genuinely, completely ready to face it. Because he wasn't fighting alone anymore, and he never intended to be alone again. not after everything he'd endured. Behind him stood loyalty, earned through fire and frost, through battles fought side by side against impossible odds. Ahead of him stood uncertainty, danger, and enemies whose power still remained largely a mystery. But uncertainty had never truly frightened him, not since the moment he'd first opened his eyes to a second chance. What frightened him now was the thought of losing what he'd built, the family, the trust, the fragile peace. And that fear, sharp and motivating, would carry him through whatever battles still waited beyond the frozen horizon. As night fell completely over the hillside villa, warmth glowed steadily from every window, a small beacon against the endless dark. Inside, laughter mixed with quiet conversation, the sounds of a family settling comfortably into another peaceful evening together. Hanfong stood at the window for a long moment, watching the snow fall gently over the world he'd rebuilt from nothing. This was never the life he expected when he first died, betrayed and forgotten, on that cold apartment floor. This was something far better, something earned through struggle, rather than given freely by an easier, kinder world. He had learned the hardest way possible that trust, once broken, could still be rebuilt into something stronger. He had learned that power, no matter how impossible, meant nothing without people worth protecting alongside it. And he had learned that survival, real survival, was never just about outlasting the cold or the chaos around him. It was about becoming someone worth surviving for, someone worth the loyalty and love others chose to offer freely. Hanfong turned away from the window, joining the warmth and laughter waiting for him inside. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever enemies still circled beyond those frozen mountains, tonight belonged entirely to his family. And that, more than any regression, any glowing power, or any hard-earned victory, felt like the truest triumph of all. The boy who once died alone, betrayed and discarded, had become a man surrounded by people who would never let that happen again. That transformation, slow and painful as it had been, remained the greatest power he'd ever discovered within himself. Stronger than red light, stronger than green, stronger even than the purple that could reshape solid steel itself. It was the simple, hard-won strength of belonging, of being chosen, of finally mattering to people who saw his true worth. The frozen world outside remained as dangerous and unpredictable as ever, filled with threats both familiar and entirely new. But inside those reinforced walls, surrounded by loyalty earned through blood, fire, and unwavering trust, Hanfong had finally found something worth calling home. Not the apartment he'd once died in, not the life he'd once lost to betrayal and cruelty. Something entirely his own, built deliberately from the ashes of his first, failed existence. A second chance, fully realized, fiercely protected, and finally, completely his. Whatever battles waited beyond the horizon, Hanfong would face them exactly the way he'd faced everything since that first frozen morning. With unwavering resolve, hard-earned power, and a family that refused to let him stand alone ever again. The Ice Age had tried to bury the world in cold, silence, and betrayal. Instead, it had forged a man who refused to be broken, and a family strong enough to survive anything. And in a world where the strong preyed endlessly on the weak, Hanfong had finally become someone worth standing beside. That, more than survival itself, was the true victory earned from his frozen, impossible second chance at life.